All right, howdy. My name is Luke Fry, and I'm going to be getting us started here. And we're talking about the Love Canal, and we're going to get into the ethics of the actions that went on with the Love Canal. Okay, so now we're going to start diving into the historical background of the Love Canal. So the Love Canal was a grand project idea by engineer William T. Love in the late 19th century, and he wanted to make a new development in Niagara Falls, New York, where the power would come from a hydroelectric power source, which was the canal he was going to dig. So he started constructing the canal, and he dug out around 3,000 feet of the canal, and the project was going well, but then he just ran out of funds. So he abandoned the project, and that was it for a little bit. But the city of Niagara Falls was not pleased with there just being a giant hole in the middle of their city in fairly valuable land, so they wanted to find a use for it. So what they ended up doing was they started using it as a landfill. So they would put it was a standard landfill, no issues with it, where they would just put garbage in it and things of that nature, no issues. But then where we start getting into the ethics issue is the Hooker Chemical Company purchased the landfill, and they started to use it as a toxic waste dump, and eventually they had put 22,000 tons of chemical waste into the Love Canal. Nothing lovely about that at all. And the chemical company eventually decided they didn't want to use the canal anymore because it was basically full to the top with toxic chemicals. So what they ended up doing was they took clay and other soil and they just filled it in. And they didn't tell anyone about it. They just filled in the land with soil with the clay, and it was they called it a barrier over the chemicals to protect Niagara Falls. And they ended up eventually selling the land, which they looked like just like a standard piece of land with no one knew that there was a ton of chemicals underneath it. They sold the land to the Niagara Falls School Board for $1, but they put in a little clause where they said you cannot hold us responsible for any environmental issues, which probably shouldn't have been a red flag for the Niagara Falls School Board, and something should be done about that. But my teammates will touch more on that later as we go on. And so the school board decided to they purchased the whole land for $1, but they said to turn a profit and take the land around the school that they were going to construct on the Love Canal and turn that into a subdivision for the homes. So as time went on, they started building the homes and the school, but the residents they started to figure out something was wrong much before the school and the city figured it out. But they had like strange things were happening, like their basements would fill with sludge, or kids would get sick, or the air just smelled weird, and the water whenever it rained would be like yellow. So there was tons of warning signs. They did not get addressed for a long time, and we'll touch much more on that later. But there's just this is how things got set in motion from the ethics point of view. All right, so we could talk for hours on the ethics behind this because it was one of the worst environmental tragedies in the United States history. But to start with a brief overview of the ethics behind it, we'll talk about how the Hooker Chemical Company, their decision to dump the toxic waste into a residential area, how that was, if they probably shouldn't have been doing that, but that's what the point of ethics is. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll also get into the failure of the government agencies, the city of Niagara Falls, the EPA, things of that nature, that they just didn't do a very good job of protecting their citizens, which is one of their main jobs. We'll talk about the Love Canal and how it's important to hold companies responsible for their wrongdoing, regardless of the situations around that. And we will also discuss the how companies have a responsibility to protect the environment and the citizens, but they don't always do so. And there's long-term effects that come with that, and companies need to be more aware of that. And like I said, held responsible whenever they don't do a very good job of that.
So, howdy, my name is Alex Ramirez. I'll be talking about the organizational causes of Love Canal. So, Love Canal disaster was a result of multiple organizational failures. The ethical lapses by the Hooker Corporation and local authorities kind of led to the kind of like toxic waste situation. The Hooker Corporation ultimately dumped a bunch of toxins in the abandoned canal, sold it to the school without fully disclosing the extent of the contamination. The school board, knowing that it was contaminated, St. Niagara Falls, then built houses and schools on the site, ignoring warnings and complaints from actual residents. The disaster kind of exposed thousands of people to harmful chemicals and caused health problems as well, birth defects, and environmental damage that can still be seen today. The Hooker Corporation and local authorities were sued by the federal government and by the residents for neglection, fraud, and environmental laws. So, kind of giving the background of what kind of just happened, we kind of wanted to go a little bit more deeper into the organizational structure of the hookup organization. It can be said that the lack of oversight by B. Clausen and kind of like the consideration of future land use led to this very, very drastic health disaster, as well as the problem of many hands that we kind of discussed in class. Definitely, it was not just the CEO. Chemical engineers were involved. They knew the harmful effects, or at the time they may have not known, but still at the same time, like, dealing with chemicals that we at the time don't know were really capable of inflicting damage on the society and stuff. I believe the chemical engineers kind of should have taken precaution into what was actually being dumped into the land, and now kind of seeing it in my side as civil engineers and understanding how groundwater works. One of the key things that I believe should have been in the minds of the Hooker Corporation is ensuring that whether or not this toxic chemicals, wherever it was encapsulated and ensured to be safe and secured somehow, some way. The Hooker Corporation did believe that by putting them in steel barrels and putting a clay cover over it could actually solve the issue, but they did not actually disclose that to any of the other stakeholders who were trying to encompass and take over the land, such as the Niagara Falls School District, who ultimately was sold for $1. And that's one of the key things that when it comes to organizational development, it's definitely needs communication is very critical when it comes to such ethical dilemmas as this. Like, where was the line of communication broken? Was it from the CEO at the top, or was it with chemical engineers not reporting it? Ultimately, it was at the fault of B. Clausen, who didn't really care too much about the land or what happened afterwards. He just wanted to get rid of it. And with that, we want to continue on to some of the environmental aspects of things. So one of the environmental ethics things that we discussed in class was the responsibility of the chemical plant, Hooker, and the responsibility for properly storing and disposing of hazardous waste that it produced. Close ties to duty ethics, as Hooker Chemical had an ethical obligation to inform the inhabitants of the community that they were living in a contaminated area, in a more extreme case to prevent and try to prevent their move. Duty to protect the environment and public health. The company's disregard for public safety and environment has become a cautionary tale and has led to stricter regulation and oversight of hazardous waste disposal. Talking about the NSP Code ethics and to preserve the health, safety, and welfare of the public is something we're going to discuss later on. We just want to inform the audience right now that this is something that we considered in our analysis of this site. Disposal of hazardous waste in residential areas. The decision to locate a hazardous dump site in the residential area without knowledge and consent to the residents was a clear violation of environmental justice. One of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit more as well is going to be the autonomy of the residents. Like, did they actually were their autonomy respected? Especially considering that they had no knowing knowledge of the contaminants that were in the site. They just knew that it was a house and they wanted to be near Niagara Falls, and it turned out to be it was a hazardous material and a hazardous waste site. And then proper lack of proper waste management protocols. Despite being aware of potential risk associated with toxic waste, they continue to dump the waste in the canal, and officials fail to take action to address the issue. And that kind of goes into more in depth of what we kind of talked about in class as well when it comes to sustainability. So as mentioned in the Brundtland report, sustainability is the ability to meet the demands of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. Did they do this? No. Chemical companies should aim to be sustainable as their responsibility to protect the environment and human health from the potential harm that their product produces. What is the purpose of chemical engineering at this point? Like, the harming of innocents seems directly against the purpose. We definitely want companies to kind of be more biocentric in their approach, to value all forms of life, and to seek to mitigate any sort of suffering to any type of living being, knowing that their chemicals come from such compounds such as carbons and hydrocarbons that could ultimately impact not just plants, not just the environment, but humans' life as well. And it's just that level of uncertainty that I believe engineers should take precaution whenever it comes to disposing of material or such like that. And with that, we're going to keep on continuing with our discussion into more of the corporate and the more ethical dilemmas when it comes to business ethics as well.
Howdy, I'm Timothy Short, and I'm going to discuss engineering professionalism and the problems we saw with Hooker and the city during this time. The first thing I want to talk about is how city officials and Hooker Chemicals severely downplayed the situation they were dealing with. Niagara Falls City Manager Donald O'Hara said, "However displeasing to the eyes and nose, the Love Canal was not a crisis matter, mainly a question of aesthetics. As Luke discussed earlier, we know that the chemicals spread around the entire city through all of the waterways and began affecting the health of the entire city of Niagara Falls. This statement was utterly incorrect and a severe understatement of the severity of the situation. To make matters even worse, the county health commissioner publicly supported this statement, which misled the public and again severely downplayed the severity of the situation in the city." The next thing I want to touch on is the city's conflict of interest with Hooker Chemical and how many concerns this raised. The two main examples we see of this were Hooker discussing building a $17 million headquarters in Niagara Falls and the fact that the company was looking to provide 3,000 jobs to the city. The discussion of the new headquarters discouraged the city from holding Hooker accountable because of the possible financial gain if the headquarters were to be built. Also, we can see the conflict of interest through the fact that the city was aware as early as 1976 that there were problems with the foundation and the chemicals beneath the residential area. One way we can analyze these things, and we've discussed this throughout the course, is through the NSPE Code of Ethics. We have learned to analyze ethical dilemmas using these rules and guidelines, and they guide professional engineers in how to best practice engineering by setting canons to abide by. We can address the issues with both organizations using the NSPE Code of Ethics. So the first canon for the NSPE Code of Ethics says to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Hooker was interested in efficient disposal and producing more chemical products rather than determining the protection of the public. So when Hooker was disposing of chemicals, as Luke discussed earlier, they were more interested in how fast they could produce more chemicals and more products rather than how they should dispose of the waste safely. The second canon we discussed in this course was to perform services in the area of competence. So both Hooker and the city were not competent in waste management, and this led to all the problems they dealt with later on. But this also led to the improper disposal of chemical waste into Love Canal, and further down the line, the issues with the public. The third canon in the Code of Ethics says, issue public statements in an objective and truthful manner. The city officials claimed there was not a serious problem, as I discussed in the last slide, and that the reason for the complaints was purely aesthetic. This was a non-factual statement, and both the city officials and the company employees knew what was going on before the statement was released. And the last canon I want to talk about was the fifth canon, which says avoid deceptive acts. Although Hooker mentioned that chemical waste could be an issue with the land they were selling, they didn't really address how bad the issue was. They didn't disclose the severity of the chemical waste underneath the land that they were selling. Similarly, Hooker did not inform the city or the developers that the clay that was holding in the chemical waste could be punctured and then leak the chemical waste elsewhere and throughout the city. So when the chemical storage tanks and chemicals were released, it went all throughout the water system in the entire city.
Howdy, my name is Nelson Espinosa, and today I'll be talking about the corporate ethics side to the Love Canal case. Now, of course, as we've already seen, a really big problem with what happened here was the violation of the first fundamental canon of the NSP Code of Ethics, holding paramount the safety, welfare, and health of the public was, of course, not taken into account here, but taken into a corporate standpoint, what is really the problem that's going on here? Now, a corporation has to abide by not only the laws of the country it's in this case, the laws of the state of New York and of the United States, but in addition, they have to worry about their own moral duty to do certain things. So when we say that there is a prioritization of profit over health, we mean that in many cases, certain laws were broken, which means that they were placing their own well-being above that of the people that they were trying to help. And chemical engineering as a profession is made to further the well-being of humanity, not to hurt it. So it would seem counterintuitive to place a higher priority on profits than over health. Of course, they have to weigh the long-term costs and benefits of their decisions, and an easy way to do this is, of course, going back to sustainability, because if a corporation is sustainable, then they are not only preparing for the short term, but also the long-term effects of what they're doing. And here's where things get interesting with the law point, because they, in addition to prioritizing their own needs, they need to, of course, abide by the laws and regulations and follow any codes of conduct in their profession, be it engineering or waste elimination services. And by doing so, a really easy way is that they can ensure that they deliver quality products and services that meet the needs and expectations of their customers, while also protecting public interest and enhancing their own social value. And, over the long term, if they're not worrying about simply putting a bunch of hazardous waste in a canal, that will cause them problems very shortly down the line. If they instead prioritize sustainability, it will be better profit-wise as well in the long term. You can say that the Hooker Chemical Company had a moral as well as a legal responsibility to clean up the hazardous waste and mitigate damage that was caused by this improper disposal. You can also say that they had a moral obligation to tell the Niagara Falls School Board, which they sold the Love Canal to, all this information. And the legal side of this was that they were technically not legally responsible for any damage that was caused by the waste, because it was sold to this school board. But was the school board properly informed of what was going on here? The company, in fact, didn't just violate the first fundamental canon and the law, but they actually went further and fought against cleanup efforts and even sued the government for the cost of cleanup. So not only did they not want to help, but they actually made it harder for other people to help by suing the government and just absolutely not wanting to cooperate in the cleanup efforts. The company's actions demonstrated a lack of corporate social responsibility and a disregard for the well-being of the public and the environment. And if you want to play devil's advocate, you can ask, were they wrong? Was the Hooker Chemical Company in fact wrong? Because they technically didn't violate any laws. They sold the canal and were not liable for it anymore under the law. But if they had done everything by the book and followed all the laws and regulation, there is still this moral purpose that you can argue that they were in some form responsible for it, either by not providing the proper information. But if that's the case, is that their fault, or should the law in some way be held accountable? Should the law be changed to account for this? And that is all problems of corporations that maybe they should not only be held accountable for the existing laws and moral obligations, but possibly even changes to the law can fall under the spectrum too. So just quickly in conclusion here, the Love Canal disaster was a case of environmental injustice and negligence that exposed residents to a large variety of hazardous chemicals and even worse health risks. The builders of the neighborhood and the school should have followed the precautionary principle, talking about risk ethics, and avoided developing the land that was previously used as a dump site for the Hooker Chemical Company. The residents, who were mostly low income and working class families, faced problems regarding diversity and prejudice, and they were ignored by the authorities because of their low status. Their autonomy was infringed on by not receiving proper information, and once they did, not having the ability to move due to their low status. Instead of concealing or downplaying the dangers of living near the canal, the Hooker Chemical Company, the laws of the neighborhood, and the people should have been informed of what was happening here. And there was also a lot of evidence of regulatory capture, as the company was able to influence the state and federal agencies to avoid liability and accountability for the contamination, thus speaking also about the legal matters that go on in corporate ethics. Finally, here's a list of our sources, and thank you so much for listening.